God asked, do you think Ayn Rand was morally perfect?
I'm not in a position to know. I've never even met Ayn Rand, so that would.
Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Well, that cut is to open our show on moral perfection. We've been planning this for a while. One place I've had an issue with Rand is on moral perfection and how I think it's led some objectivists to be, frankly, hesitant to admit when they're wrong. And, we've got clips from Harry Binswanger, Gena Gorlin, Tara Smith, and even Yaron talking about the topic.
Well, that opening tease is an interesting clip because Onkar makes a point that he can't judge Ayn Rand because he never met her. And that seems a little odd. I mean, he's one of the foremost authorities on her philosophy. So I imagine he's studied her thought thoroughly. So if anyone is in a position to judge a dead person, he should be in that position to do so. So I think he's kind of taking a sort of weaselly way out of the question. He could have answered it in several different ways, providing any context he wants. Preambling his judgment by saying he never met her, but based on what he's learned about her or read the things that she's written, this is how he evaluates her. And because mostly it should be based on her rationality, and that comes out in her written works. And there's a lot of video of her also speaking and answering questions and talking about her life. So I think you could judge Ayn Rand, and I happen to think she was perfect or nearly perfect. I've caught her in a couple of mistakes, which I think she should have caught herself. So it's kind of a puzzle. It's a puzzle for me to try to figure out why she made these mistakes. But overall, in general, I think she was just one of the most rational people in the world, and so therefore I judge her as morally perfect.
Well, that's fair. I mean, I don't know that I question whether perfection, because of how it's been conflated with Christian morality over time to mean that, zero imperfections and doing nothing morally wrong. And I'm not even, I think that part of his hesitance is because of closed objectivism has this kind of premise that you have to see Rand as perfect. And I think that ends up playing a role here. And, he just ends up, like you said, demurring that, he didn't know. But it's like, as we get into these clips, they talk about, perfection is partially about doing your best, according to the objectivist definition. But I mean, maybe he could have asked some other people that knew Ayn Rand since he had such access to them. I don't know that he was doing his best, but let's
Well, I think he's talked to Leonard Peikoff, I'm sure.
Right.
And so he's talked to people who knew Ayn Rand. I mean, Harry Binswanger, Peikoff, and others. So he's got to have a lot of insight into her character, even the private moments that we don't know about. So that's what gets me, is that he's refusing to answer the question, basically, and giving up what I think is a poor excuse. Because you don't have to know someone personally to have a judgment about them. These people have never met Donald Trump, yet they hate his guts. So it just
exactly.
It doesn't make sense. They judge Donald Trump. They judge all these politicians they've never met. So you don't have to meet somebody to judge them, and to judge them at a very high level sometimes if you know a lot about.
Did Rand want them hesitating on making moral judgments in the first place?
Right. And how bad is it if you're hesitating on judging Rand as a moral ideal?
Exactly.
Obviously, someone who created, one of the best arguments I've heard is that someone who created such a philosophy had to be like a great person, right? because it's such a great philosophy, it couldn't have been created by a scumbag. So at minimum, he could have said that she was a very moral person or very highly moral person. He didn't have to go to
I think
perfection.
as later in the clip, he does talk a little about that. But I mean, yeah, the beginning hesitance, I think, is the closer to the real answer. But I want to shift a little bit to Rand's take on perfection before we start playing some of these other clips. This is from Galt's speech. She says, man has a single basic choice to think or not, and that is the gauge of his virtue. Moral perfection is an unbreached rationality, not the degree of your intelligence, but the full and relentless use of your mind, not the extent of your knowledge, but the acceptance of reason as an absolute. So, my first question in that is, what is unbreached? Does that mean if you ever breach it, you can't be perfect? I mean, some objectivists seem to think it can be moment by moment, that you can be perfect in a later part of your life.
Well, first of all, I think it has to be a conscious decision, like you're consciously going against your morals. That usually is an obvious thing, because people in general have a moral system. They have some sort of morality that they live by. And if other people see you acting in a weird, strange, abnormal way, that's going to be a dead giveaway. So if you're just thinking immoral things, that's everybody thinks weird stuff, but you don't act on it. So, but if you're acting on something that goes against your history, your moral history, the people are going to notice, right? And so then you can start calling it like a breach of your morality, or start questioning it at least. So, and usually if you're doing this yourself, and of course I've done this in my youth. I one time I forged my father's signature to get out of school, and stuff like that.
Signed William's father.
Yeah, and I got caught because I'm stupid as a young boy, and the adults in the room know what's going on. So I got caught, and you feel bad. These things come with bad feelings about yourself, unless you're a complete like psychopath, sociopath, and have no feelings. But normal people will feel bad about breaching their morality, and so it's hard to do, especially if you're really breaching it, like a bad breach and doing something awful. It's hard to do because you can't fight those feelings. So I think it's usually pretty obvious when there's a breach of morality, especially in action. And you can think of it as a kind of barrier, like if you're in the trenches and they breach your defenses, the enemy breaches your defenses, you put up this wall of morality around you and saying, I'm not going to break through this wall. These are my principles. I'm going to stand behind these principles. And then when you feel yourself breaking down that wall and doing something outside of your morality, you realize that internally, and it starts eating you up.
Yeah, I think that's going on, but there are many more subtle cases. I mean, one of the, Yaron's charges against me was dishonesty. He's just gonna, if he's decided he doesn't like somebody, he's just gonna say they're dishonest. So it's not always obvious necessarily when the breach of morality is occurring.
Well, it could be him projecting, because in my view, he's just projecting that onto you. He's the one being dishonest. But if you don't feel like you're being dishonest and you think, no, I'm telling the truth here, you're either telling the truth or you're deceiving yourself. Maybe you should go back through your history and figure out if you're actually contradicting yourself. But in most cases, I just chalk it up to Yaron projecting his own psychology onto you.
Yeah, but it's not just me. I mean, that's just a charge of the movement against people that are, disagreeing or have a different take. It's why people within the movement are hesitant to say they even, see something wrong or where they have disagreements with Rand, as we'll get to in a later clip. But I do have some clips of Rand talking about perfection and the ideal man. From the goal of my writing, she said, the motive and purpose of my writing is the projection of an ideal man, the portrayal of a moral ideal as my ultimate literary goal, as an end in itself, to which any didactic, intellectual, or philosophical values contained in a novel are only the means. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
she was a writer, and so she projected her ideal man. And I think this might contribute to some of the problems objectivists have. Unfortunately, they take these fictional heroes and use them as examples for moral perfection and reality. Like if someone were to ask somebody like an objectivist, what is your idea of the moral man? They would like point to John Galt,
Well,
who's a
we've got clips about that too. So
who's a fictional character. So while in her context, in Ayn Rand's context of being a writer of fiction, it's very important for her to portray her ideal man. But it makes you wonder, like, is this because she couldn't find the ideal man in reality, so that became a focus of her fantasy world? What if her real world was populated by a bunch of ideal men? Then maybe we would have gotten something else in her fictional work. It would have gone to a different level.
She could have been more naturalistic if there were all a bunch of ideal men. But
yeah, and maybe
she
would have jumped to nonfiction more quickly. Like maybe she would have been more interested in reality instead of her fantasy world. So that would have been interesting.
Yeah, if she hadn't had to flee the communist revolution. But she was actually on with did an interview with James Day talking about the distinguishing characteristics of an ideal man.
You have said that your primary purpose in writing is to project the ideal man. For those who may not have read Atlas Shrugged and have not yet met Hank Rearden or John Galt, how would you describe the ideal man?
Well, it actually took me about 700,000 words in Atlas Shrugged to describe him, so it's impossible to give a description. But I could tell you only the essential characteristics. Above everything else, a rational man.
A rational man.
Rational man, a man guided exclusively by reason, an independent man, and a man of great self-esteem. I would name these three as distinguishing characteristics, the essential ones of what I regard as an ideal man.
So I find that interesting because she leaves out purpose. Her top cardinal values in her philosophy are reason, purpose, and self-esteem. But her ideal man includes being independent. So that's a virtue, but I'm not sure it's like the essential virtue. I think it comes along later after you find your purpose in life, and have self-esteem.
I think she meant just like moral independence, not just going along with the tribe.
Perhaps, I mean, she didn't really clarify, but
yeah,
she does talk about independence, in her works.
Right.
So,
but it's a little broad. I mean, are you imperfect if your country gets invaded or if you join a social club?
Yeah, and if you physically can't be independent, like if you're dependent on others to provide for you because you're handicapped or something like that, physically or mentally, does that like make you can't achieve moral perfection because of that? Or maybe they were just talking about the ideal man. Sorry, but you can't be an ideal person because you have some amount of dependence on other people. I mean, also you could argue philosophically, that everyone in a city is dependent on other people in the city. there's an interdependence.
Well, there's a
Because you have
difference between collaboration and collectivism and just fully giving in to whatever the tribe says.
Yeah, so it's a little unclear what she means by independent. Like, how independent do you have to be?
Right.
Um,
And that matters, when you're talking about the ideal. But, Harry Binswanger wrote about perfection in the Objectivist Forum in 1981, when Rand was still alive, called it The Possible Dream. And we can post a link to the article, but he recounts that he wrote The Possible Dream in 1980 and sent her a copy. And he says, she explained to me very gently why what I had drafted wouldn't do. She thought it would have to be rewritten from scratch. Some of it she thought was off philosophically, and some of it she thought was getting too much into issues outside philosophy. For instance, I had a section on the need for personal growth. So he says he rewrote it and it was approved, but I'm fascinated by that wording that seems to say she considered personal growth outside the realm of philosophy. I mean, these days, Orthodox objectivism sometimes mainly sells itself as a personal growth vehicle.
yeah, and this personal growth issue is something I thought about regarding her standard of value. So she doesn't seem to appreciate the standard of life.
Right, life
life,
as a standard, right?
life as a standard of value. So I started thinking about the relationship of that standard to how we grow as people. Every living thing grows, and that seems to be its natural purpose. A seed grows into a tree, and a little baby grows into an adult. We grow, and it seems like everything we do, drink and eat and play and train and learn, it's all about growing uh, ourselves as a living organism and becoming something, more productive. Um, and until we reach an age where that becomes impossible, we start dying, we start losing muscle mass, we start losing mental capacity, and we
It can
go
happen. There are
downhill.
some people that keep growing intellectually. She alludes to that. She says in Galt's speech something like, to the widest erudition he may receive by the end of his life.
Yeah, I mean, some people, can continue learning until they die. I mean, because they don't lose that mental sharpness. Sometimes you start forgetting little things. I think it's generally when you get older, your mind starts slipping a little bit. But you still, if you work at it, I think older people can still generate really fascinating ideas. They can think.
Yeah,
So
and there's a genetic component to who can and who can't.
yeah, unfortunately, there are diseases, that the older people suffer from. Uh, but even, and I guess even in your body, you can work on your body up until death. But if you live a long enough time, like 100 years or so, you're gonna start just decaying. You're just deteriorating because you've lived such a long life and there's been such pressure on your body that you just can't sustain it, and your cells start dying.
Right.
I think usually that's due to all the sun exposure you've had, or all the radiation you've had.
That's
Radiation.
one of my points, that part of the, perfection is difficult in conjunction with mortality, because there is a time where that decay starts setting in, like you're saying.
Especially when it comes to using your reason. If your reason starts deteriorating due to age and the effects of nature on your body, that's hard to deal with.
Yeah.
So I think generally, you're in your prime of life when you're in your like 30s, probably 20s and 30s, and then 40s and 50s. I think you start reaching middle age, and you start kind of like leveling off or maybe declining, and then after that, it's just all downhill.
Right.
But but I think people who are in their 30s and 40s who are very like rational and focused on reason, you look to them for the moral ideal, and physical ideal as well. I mean, it's related. The physical and the mental are related, so there's going to be some connection there,
Well,
which is
we've
why I
got
think, yeah, go ahead.
some clips of people saying, that perfection has to do more with what you can achieve. But and it starts with Harry. Binswanger did a video, why perfection is possible. And we'll get to his clip. In this first clip, he blames kind of religion or Christianity for the view that no one is perfect.
The Greeks would not have understood the idea you can't be perfect. Plato did sell the idea in geometry, but he had to argue for it because it was not the Greek view. The Greek view was the good is of value to you and you can get it. That was a much healthier culture. But after Christianity, it's become commonplace to think you can't live with moral perfection because you'd have to kill yourself. You'd have to die on some cross like Christ did. So the origin of this anti-perfection idea is a mystical, supernatural, anti-human idea of what perfection would be.
So what's your take on that clip?
I mean, I think he's overgeneralized Greece as this perfect utopian ideal to advance the notion that everything was great until Greece fell and Christianity rose. But I mean, you go back to Sophocles, he said, all men make mistakes, but a good man yields when he knows his course is wrong and repairs the evil. The only crime is pride. That was from Antigone. And so, that view did exist. Again, that's why I went back to the idea that it has to do with mortality. In fact, that they used to say that to the emperor, remember thou art mortal. So it just, I don't know that it's, also John Wesley and the Methodists, they sought perfection. So did Benjamin Franklin, who aspired to emulate Jesus and Socrates. So, and that's even the Greek myth about flying too close to the sun and the wax melting. Some of it's just saying, don't get too cocky.
Yeah, I think this idea of the world, like perfection being impossible in this world, probably began with Plato or whoever Plato learned from, because Plato had this idea of the Platonic forms, and then everything in this on earth was imperfect instantiate of the perfect forms. So the general idea of not being able to achieve perfection began long before Christianity. But the idea of Jesus being like the only perfect person, and so everyone who follows Jesus, they have to submit to him in order to get to heaven, and you're a sinful person and therefore you can't get to heaven without Jesus. That's a application, I think, of the more general idea that came out of Greece, with the Platonic realm. So
Yeah,
I think
he
I
addresses Plato.
think what he's doing, I think he's putting an emphasis on one aspect of Christianity, which and then using that as the example of all Christianity. Because we also have to remember that in the beginning there were basically two branches of Christianity. One that believed Jesus was the Son of God, and one that didn't. So Jesus could have been taken as just a man, or a son of God, like a child of God or whatever, who can be used as a moral example, and you could achieve what Jesus achieved if you didn't believe that he was this God, but he was a person, and so you could do what another person can do. And so Jesus taught us in parables and actions, things like that, and you could mimic that. And
Right, but I mean, it's the supernatural aspect that kind of makes him perfect.
I know, but what I'm saying is, in the beginning, there was a lesser degree of that idea. You know, people didn't believe. Some people didn't believe that. They didn't believe in the
Yeah.
Trinity. Some Christians didn't believe in the Trinity, and they fought over that.
You're
So
right. They thought, it was not making them exactly the same was, dissing Jesus as divinity.
yeah, and so I think there were also debates on whether you were inherently sinful. Like
Right.
Jesus was just a guide. You know, he was a teacher, teaching you how to be moral,
But
and so you could follow that and follow in his footsteps and become a moral person yourself. And you weren't plagued by this original sin idea.
I just think part of it is how perfection is defined. In this next clip, Harry seems to say you just have to keep changing your standards to achieve perfection.
The essence of the reason why you can't say perfection is impossible is you made up the standard, or you accepted somebody else's standard. It came from somebody's decision that this is what full good would be. But it's irrational. You should reject it. You should take a achievable standard and one based upon an actual value to you, of which your life is the overarching value to you. Without life, no other values are possible.
Well, he latches on to the word achievable. He says you need an achievable standard.
Right.
I think that is a mistake. I kind of understand where he's going. He wants to say that you because you made up the standard, it's achievable. You know, you made it up, and so you can do it. But really, we want to find an objective standard, like what is true and real. What is the actual standard for moral perfection? And so I think that's where you need to go. You need to look at reality and like what actually would be morally perfect in reality. And that kind of means like what is the best thing to do? Like what would be the most logical, most rational thing for you to do in your life?
I'm just not sure we need a concept of perfection. I mean, especially if the standards are going to be relative and changeable to what we think we can do at the time.
Yeah, you might have a failure of imagination. You can't think of what's actually perfect. Then what's the point of coming up with some arbitrary standard for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. So, well, when Harry is asked for examples of moral perfection, to your earlier point, he has to go back to the novels.
What does moral perfection actually look like? I assume you would agree not everybody actually is morally perfect, but you're arguing that they can be. What does a morally perfect person look like, and why is that possible?
Read Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, and you'll see morally perfect people. The heroes and heroines of those novels are morally perfect.
This comes up again later when Gena Gorlin and Yaron kind of gently refuse to name any actual examples of perfect people they assure us exist in real life.
Well, so Ben is asking Harry, what does moral perfection look like? It's a pretty straightforward question. And I don't know why Harry just didn't say, look at Ayn Rand. I mean, that's the closest I can think of to an unbreached rationality. So if he's going to go with Rand's description of moral perfection as an unbreached rationality, just point to Ayn Rand or point to Albert Einstein or point to some genius inventor or genius explorer, people who have done great, amazing things in history that required extreme rationality, like an
But,
unbreached rationality.
once you start using perfect, I mean, Einstein leaned left, you can start, and that's what people do to those that are glorified in society. They pick them apart. And I don't think that's fair, but should you be using the term morally perfect if you can't name some in reality? And I mean, even Ben says to him, he's like, I assume you don't think all people are morally perfect? As if he's unsure.
Yeah, that was a weird phrasing, but like I'm not going to point specifically to Albert Einstein as a generally moral perfection, as an example of moral perfection generally. I'm just saying, I think when in his realm of reason, he's at the top, level. And so you can make an argument. Look, he may have made a few mistakes in his theories or whatever, but generally he came up with this brilliant idea, that people still use. You can maybe point to Newton, in his time, within his context of knowledge, this guy was a morally perfect genius, one of the top thinkers in history. Or you could point to someone who did some great exploring. I like Christopher Columbus, even though he didn't know where he was going. He was brave.
They do say he butchered natives.
Yeah, but everyone pretty much took slaves back then. So that you have to kind of put him in his context. He was a brave explorer. He was willing to cross an unknown sea to try to find a new trade route. And he ended up finding a new continent, or at least finding it for the Europeans. So you got to put them in their context. Not everyone's a morally perfect person in today's standards, but in their own day, they were a very great person. So
yeah, I mean, that's legit to judge them by the standards of the day, but yeah, I mean, that would be better, but we don't even know if they were morally perfect by that standard. But
I know, but you have it's a context of knowledge thing. So this goes back to what Onkar was saying. He never met Rand. I mean, come on. So you have to put all of your evaluations within a context of knowledge. That's one of the main features of objectivism, is that you can't just use omniscience as an excuse, lack of omniscience as an excuse for not evaluating something. You're never going to know every little detail about somebody.
right, but to say perfect is a positive statement where you've seen, where and some of it you just can't say authoritatively enough they were perfect if they lived in a time before their lives were recorded.
But that's what I'm saying, is you go by your context of knowledge. It's not, nobody can fault you for making an evaluation based on what you know.
My point is that perfection should be used much more sparingly. But Harry,
wait, hold on. Let me just make another point about what Ben was saying, or what Harry was saying. It's like you said before, he goes back to the fictional characters, and this is a big problem, because there's this heavy reliance on using fictional characters as examples of moral perfection. Like if someone asks you, what does moral perfection look like? Well, it doesn't look like some fictional character in a book. Moral perfection has to look like a real person, like reality,
right?
Things that actually exist, things that are actually possible. Galt does a lot of things that we haven't created a static electricity motor. He created this weird like mirror reflection thing over Galt's Gulch. So it's things might be in the future. Maybe we can do that in the future, but that's not something you can do now. And plus, Galt, it lives within a very contrived world where things are collapsing and everything's going according to what Rand wanted to happen. She invented this world. It's not even our world.
Right. It's not the same context. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, Harry also tries to equate the swearing in of a witness with perfection.
Full perfection means using reason honestly, fully. You know, the statement in court, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If you go by that in your mind, that is moral perfection.
Well, there he's just using a courtroom cliche about truth. And I think that's another incorrect way to go about describing moral perfection, because it's just a cliche, and it doesn't have a lot of substance. It's just something you promise to do in a courtroom, you know.
Your earlier point was about it being an action. And he's trying to say it's more in your mind, that if you're seeking the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, that kind of rationalistic process is perfection.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand to some degree, being reasonable is about seeking the truth. But reason, reason is its own thing. It's its own cognitive process. And sometimes you can use it incorrectly without knowing, without being dishonest. So it's more about you being an honest user of your own mind, of your own thinking.
I mean, a lot of times when I try to get a closed objectivist to debate about Kelly, they almost invariably don't want to talk about it anymore. Is that seeking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Or are they more concerned about getting kicked out of the club if they see any of my points? Yeah, and
I
go ahead.
think they're applying evasion in those cases, and that's definitely a breach of rationality.
That's not perfect. We had talked last episode about how Yaron had erased sections of YouTube video about mistakes that he's made, and when he claimed he didn't think he properly disagreed with his guest Brian Kaplan enough when he defended open objectivists. To me, when one is seeking the appearance of perfection, which would be important to the leadership of a philosophy that insisted that everyone better be morally perfect if they want to live, it could make them inclined to rewrite reality to remove any blemishes. And you're right, that is evasion on some level. I mean, Yaron admitted his mistakes, then erased that reality from the record. Is that morally perfect by anyone's definition? Is he seeking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth when he's editing the record of what was said?
Yeah, I think it's a problem that he hasn't adequately explained. Again, I don't like getting into people's heads too much, but it does seem like there's something weird going on with him deleting those clips. They don't paint him in the best light. He exposes his own mistakes or things that mistakes he thinks he's made. But on a more, I guess, superficial level, I think if you're subjecting yourself to the live stream format, which he does a lot, I think you should respect that format and preserve the live content as is. Of course, if there's something egregious that happens, and you just, it shouldn't be public anymore, then I can understand that. But in these cases, nothing egregious happened. I mean, Kaplan said something that he didn't approve of, and then he failed to respond. I mean, that's not egregious. That's just you failing to respond in the way you wanted to respond on a live broadcast. And so that happens a lot. It happens in our pre-recorded or in our live recordings here where we record it before publication, so we have an opportunity to edit, but we don't do a whole lot of editing. So a lot of what I say, that's not perfect, and maybe I made a mistake in one of our last broadcasts and had to correct it on YouTube. So mistakes happen when you're doing something live or relatively live, and you have to deal with that because that's the nature of just having a conversation or having a dialogue with somebody.
Right. facing your mistakes is part of an unbreached morality. Back to Harry on moral perfection. This one, is sort of in contrast to what he said in his letter, because in this one, Ayn Rand told him that perfection is compatible with self-improvement.
Perfection is compatible with improvement. This was the point that Ayn Rand made to me when she was editing my manuscript. The killer is the view that if you can improve something, that means it wasn't perfect before. Perfection is full satisfaction of a rational standard of value. Well, what counts as full satisfaction? It's what's possible at that time. So, for instance, a child learning to do something like to walk, he can be perfect at it given his abilities at that time, even though later he'll be able to dance.
Well, after thinking about what he's saying there, I think he's generally right. I don't see a huge issue here. It's just some little phrasing, the way he contextualizes the baby, learning to walk, I think could be refined, because a baby, his purpose isn't really to go on to dance. It's the baby's purpose is to get up off its ass and start walking, like it sees its parents walking. I think it's a sort of mimicry thing. It's trying to do what the parents are doing. So it's going to get up and stumble. That's all part of the process. It's going to get up and fall. It's going to then start walking a few steps and then fall, and then eventually it'll learn to just consistently walk.
Right.
The whole process can be perfect because that's the process. That's what it takes to learn how to walk. If it were to give up, like in some cases, children give up speaking or something like that, then that's a failure. That's not perfect. You need to
I
correct
like what you're saying about the process itself being the type of perfection. I can accept that, but the idea of that a baby walking is part of perfection, I think at least somewhat cheapens the idea of Rand's definition of an unbreached rationality, if a baby can achieve.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so he's sort of distancing himself from the essence of moral perfection, which Rand gave in the earlier clip. So, it's the baby. You could say the baby's using its cognitive process to learn how to walk. It's obviously observing its surroundings and figuring out what it's doing wrong. But at a baby level, baby thinking level, it's not consciously rational or using logic or anything like that. But
then is it just getting better?
And in some cases, it's almost reflexive. So that wouldn't be using its reason. It's just reflexively getting up off the ground. But
right.
Also, there's a difference between a child's standard of moral perfection and an adult's standard of moral perfection. Because you're mature. Your body and your mind is mature when you're an adult, and so you should be in your full bloom.
But I mean, at some point, there may just be a goal to be achieved. And it's either achieved or it's not. And it's like you can say, well, the child did his best. And I mean, I can understand that, but I don't think perfect should be applied to the full execution.
Well, yeah, I'm agreeing with you. I think that his example was misplaced.
Okay.
And it was not a good example for self-improvement being compatible with perfection, because if you're going to talk that way, you should talk about improving your thinking or your ideas, something related directly to your use of reason. And that really should just be an adult example. Should start using, adults who are thinking about things. And if you make a mistake which is honest, then you're still perfect, because that's kind of like the child learning how to walk. That's you learning how to think rationally. So the whole process of getting to the point where you're just on all cylinders thinking rationally, that's going to take some time. You're going to make mistakes, you're going to make fallacies, but it can be an honest process, because you're in some level you're in ignorance of what full reason would look like.
Sure. Well, Harry was on with Nikos, also talking about perfection, and Harry gives this other definition here.
Perfect in the first kind of cut at it is the best among the possible alternatives. The best among the possible alternatives. The best among the possible alternatives. I have a more formal definition. Perfection is the flawlessly complete satisfaction of a rational standard. The flawlessly complete satisfaction of a rational standard. And it's contextual. What is a rational standard depends upon your capabilities and what the circumstances are and what's possible. So the starting point is your abilities and what reality offers. And it's within that you have to choose.
Boy, a little bit there, he sounded like Kamala Harris, didn't he? The best among possible alternatives. He like repeated that 3 or 4 times.
I think he was trying to emphasize each part, to be fair to him.
Okay. It just struck me as a little weird.
To me, I think, we don't always know the best of alternatives. I remember after the iPad came out, people said, I never realized how much I needed a device like this. It's the point of creating something new. If you want to say that the inventors and the creators make perfection more possible, I could go along with that. But I don't know, the best of all possible alternatives seems like an easy way for people who just want to assert that they're perfect. Yaron claimed Fauci had no choice but to call for lockdowns. Did that make lockdowns perfect? I mean, anyone can say it was the best choice possible to excuse what they wanted to do anyway.
Right. Yeah, I think this is a fundamental issue, because he's sort of saying that you have to take into consideration what's possible to you. But that's not always obvious.
Right.
So and also on the other hand, if reason isn't possible to you because you're mentally handicapped or something like that, then what does that say about an unbreached rationality being the standard? I think it means that you can be morally perfect even if you're irrational. Like if you have some, I don't know if this is an actual disease or not, but like if you're you're mentally incapable of telling the truth, like you have some sort of form of Tourette's or something, you have to consider all these weird situations now, and see how they apply to his standard.
But I mean, it's just the idea that, if you can evade anything by just, there are people that don't want to, stand up to the left, but they still telling themselves they're doing the best they can.
Yeah. It gets very, psychological, and I'm not so sure we need to be going in that direction. Like,
hate this next clip then.
I'm just saying, like, the standard of moral perfection should be more objective than you having to pry into someone's brain and psychologize them. You should be able to determine whether someone's being rational just based on what they're saying and doing, and not whether they're honest or not. If like you usually aren't the one determining whether you're morally perfect. You're just trying to be a good person, you're trying to be rational, living your life. When it matters whether someone's a morally perfect person is when you are judging somebody else, because you need to evaluate them Like, how moral is this person? Should I be friends with them? Can I trust them? Should I consider what they're saying, or just think that they're spouting bullshit?
I'm for
You know?
moral judgment, but should perfection be the standard, or just getting a sense of they seem pretty good so far?
Yeah, I mean, but that's also, if they're good, then you might meet them once a week. But if they're perfect, you kind of want to hang around with that person and learn from them, right? They're
I
going to
mean,
be
it takes time to even get to being able to say someone's perfect. You'd have to spend years with them without ever seeing a flaw.
well, I think you can do it in a quicker time than that. If you spend more and more time, like, you realize, wow, guy is really rational and really honest with me. And then you start spending more and more time with them, and you can judge them in a really full manner within a short period of time. I don't think it's going to take years. Because again, I believe in a context of knowledge. So yeah, you may make a mistake, but if you yourself are rational and know how to evaluate people properly, then you can boil down your evaluation into, like, litmus tests. Like, I have one litmus test that I think is almost foolproof. Like, if someone believes that a woman is a man or a man is a woman, and gets fooled by the whole transgender thing, then that's a litmus test that pretty much fails them.
But a
As
litmus test is a deal breaker. You can't use that to then say anyone who, believes the other way is perfect.
no, I just think you can't be an honest person or a rational person and believe that a man is a woman. So
Well,
you have to have a certain grounding in reality to be
right, but you
rational.
could say that about a myriad of issues about, and that's why it takes a while to, you have to determine that they have zero flaws after a long period of time before you can declare them perfect. But
Well,
objectivist,
you just have, I think it has to be a range of zero flaws. Like, it doesn't have to be like every single thing in the future. Like, you do these litmus tests, you do like several of them, maybe a dozen or so, and then you say, wow, that guy's either perfect or near perfect, you
yeah,
know.
near perfect, I can accept. But I do want to move on to this next clip. Objectivist psychologist Gena Gorlin was on with Rucka when he was hosting Ayn Rand Center UK, and with her take on the valid conception of a moral ideal.
What, if any, is the valid conception of a moral ideal that we can fully embrace, right? Could fully uncompromisingly hold ourselves to? And I think that objectivism provides one. And I think that there's a lot of psychological nuance in how we hold that ideal so that it is something we're trying to build, right? So on this builder's mindset that I've been on about, right? It's something that we can hold up for ourselves as a guide, as a horizon, right? As a standard worth reaching for. And we can identify cases. We can identify not just fictional, but real life examples. And for me, that's been really crucial. Like, there are a few people I know, and I mentioned this, I think, in the article. There are a few people I know who I would say, like they've pretty much got it.
Well, I'm glad that she has real life examples. I hope that she provides these examples and tells us who they are one of these days.
Right. She had an article on the quest for psychological perfection. And she says that, she has several who she's found internalized. She says, I won't call them out by name here, lest it offend their modesty, though I suspect they probably know who they are. But, I mean, that's kind of the same mindset you'd use for any kind of mentor, or actually Maslow had the same formulation, but he called them the self-actualized. And you could say the self-actualized and being the highest level of man's needs is a type of perfection. But I feel more comfortable with self-actualized than perfect.
Yeah, and so she says, lest it offend their modesty. Is modesty a virtue? Like, why why would that concern her? Like, so if I were, if someone said I were morally perfect, it wouldn't offend my modesty, because I don't consider modesty a high virtue.
Right.
I'd just say, okay, I'm flattered, that you think I'm morally perfect. It's great for you recognizing me. That would make me think more of them, that they were able to come out and give their evaluation publicly and without hiding behind this excuse of offending someone's modesty. So in that case, I disagree with Gena, but I
Yeah.
am happy. I am happy that she's thinking about these things in terms of objective reality, real people. And
Even if
I'm
she
glad.
won't name them.
Yeah,
Um,
I trust that she actually has evaluated these people as morally perfect. So I'm happy for her. I have friends that I won't name, mostly in the hiking community, who I think are morally perfect, at least in terms of being rational, because
as
it takes
being
a
hikers.
hikers, because I hike with well, we do a lot of like tough scrambling and stuff, and you don't want to be a partner with someone who's a dumbass
Sure.
and and then go off on some difficult scramble in the mountains and not be able to rely on their use of their reason or their thinking. They have to be able
Absolutely. It's life or death.
to,
Well,
and
partially preparing for this episode, I asked Yaron if it would be useful to have concrete examples of perfect people. And he basically says because Christians use Jesus as their example of perfection, that objectivists can go back to Rand's fiction for perfection, even if he still knows a guy.
A perfection which none of us can attain is Jesus, and they have an aesthetic model. So do we. Atlas Shrugged is filled with examples from Dagny to Reardon to, of course, the perfection of John Galt. Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead is a great example. So art is exactly for that. In real life, yeah, it would be great to have examples. Find them. That's your job in your life, and even better, do it yourself. But what am I going to say? Here's Joe. I think Joe is a perfect human being. All of you should emulate Joe. I mean, that's absurd. That's ridiculous. That would, should we worship Joe? What do we do with Joe? Should we say prayers to Joe? I mean, what do we do with Joe now? I mean, I know a Joe who's, I think, perfect. Does that help you, Scott? What the hell?
oh my God. So he went through that whole thing trying to say that it's not going to help you if I point to some, person in reality who's morally perfect. And then he points to Joe. Why doesn't he describe Joe?
Exactly. He claims to know one perfect guy, but he's not even sure what we should do with him. I mean, if he identifies him, maybe he should lead the objectivist movement.
Well, so on one hand, he's using now he's like approving and using the rhetorical techniques of religious people who point to, like, say, what would Jesus do? And so now he's going to say, what would John Galt do? Now, how is that going to help us any more than describing Joe? Like, Joe's a real person in this world. We'd probably learn a lot more from how to act in this world by looking at Joe than by looking at a fictional character in Ayn Rand's make-believe world. So we're not in the world of Atlas Shrugged. All we can learn, her novels are great entertainment and great philosophy. Like, we learn the philosophy from her books, and we can apply the principles to our lives. But are we going to look at John Galt and say, oh, I need to do everything John Galt did? That's not going to help us much. The philosophy helps us. And the characters entertain us. So he's
defensive about it. He's saying, like, you go find the perfect people. I already know a perfect guy. And then what if I identify him and say you should emulate him? That's absurd. Why is it absurd? Shouldn't we be emulating perfect people in real life?
Yeah, or at minimum, we learn from them. maybe we're in a similar situation as Joe because we live in the same world, and so we're gonna do something that Joe did. Like we're gonna say, "Oh yeah, that was the right move," And
Yeah,
so go
I
ahead.
just don't know if we should all be holding ourselves to perfection, seeing how rare it is that even Yaron only knows one guy.
Yeah, that's another good point, and something I wanted to bring up is that it seems like they're trying to paint moral perfection as this rare thing, when I think it's more common because most people are not evil bastards, and so they're going to be living a very rational life if they survive into adulthood. They've got to be pretty rational to survive into adulthood, or else you're just going to bounce your car off a cliff and die, or do something stupid and die. So most people are honest, with reality and themselves, and they have to be pretty honest with other people, or else they're criminals and they'll be sent to jail. So if you meet someone on the street who doesn't have a criminal history, or is into psychopath, they're generally going to be on, trending toward moral perfection. They may not be.
You can do that. I just don't think you're differentiating enough between good and perfect,
Well,
or even mostly good.
perfect is a form of good. So it depends on what you mean by good. Do you mean they sometimes make mistakes, or conscious errors
Well,
and
that's
lie
what
to
you should be
themselves?
saying about perfect. I mean, does perfect mean you can make mistakes? And I think that's debatable. And the term certainly has a usage that means no mistakes. And
So
that's
I
why
think
I think it's
like
confusing.
perfection would be the best. So you have good, better, best.
Can
So
everyone
there's
be the best?
no, no. Obviously, not everyone can be the best,
But
but
then,
it also relates to what context you're talking about. Like if you're, it's very rare, I think, to have a morally perfect person in every moral category. So like I'm not the type who would run off to war and defend my country. First of all, I'm older. I'm not going to be a very good soldier. Um, but even when I was younger, I that wasn't my passion. My passion was thinking and reading and writing philosophy. So, but a person who's very courageous and wants to protect their family and protect their country and goes to war and defeats the enemy and is like this badass in battle, that's a level of moral perfection I could never achieve. But on the other
that's
hand, that
not the whole
person,
character, right? They could be terrible to their kids.
yeah, and in other categories, they might be bad. And, or they might just be neutral, like they're not top in that category.
That's fine.
So,
I don't know that we should be applying, perfection to the whole being, or to say he's perfect in that area, which I think is more fair. But I do want to switch gears here because James Valliant and Robert Nasir did a show on perfection as well. And they even had some radio shows of Peikoff talking about it, and play a clip of Peikoff getting a radio caller to say that he's perfect. And James then calls himself morally perfect. But in case that wasn't enough, he talks about Michael Leibowitz, someone else we've had on, and as we talked about, went to prison for 25 years. He found Rand and turned his life around, but James goes farther to say that he can still be morally perfect.
Confronted with his own mistake, and he was aware it was a moral error. In that sense, if you look at his whole life, he's by no means morally perfect. On the other hand, is perfection still achievable for him now? Absolutely. And talk about heroically overcoming a psychological context. We all have psychologies. In fact, I'm going to back up and go further. In this modern corrupt world, there is absolutely no way you don't have psychological issues that you have to confront and overcome. There is no way. We all do. We all have psychologies.
we all have psychologies.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying in this corrupt modern world, everyone has psychological problems. And so, I mean, I understand he's defending Leibowitz, but he goes with, and every single one of you is screwed up psychologically too. I just think that has shades of original sin, of being inherently flawed, even when you're blaming a corrupt society, that none of us can be psychologically perfect. Is that, consistent with Rand's heroic view of man? It's certainly not tabula rasa.
Well, it's a little unclear to what extent he thinks we're psychologically damaged due to our environment. I don't know. I'm not sure I'd call it like original sin like. It's more like deterministic like. So you're determined by your environment.
Wasn't that what James Taggart kept saying? None of us can help it. It's not my fault.
Right. It's something like that. This society around you contaminates your soul or something. It's some weird thing like that. But what he's saying about Leibowitz, if you listen to the rest of that clip, go back to that episode, Leibowitz himself says he doesn't consider himself perfect. So I think there's a little bit of twisting of the truth going on there.
James likes him, so he's trying to speak well of him. But the idea, the deeper issue, if you can still be perfect going forward, won't that just lead to some people saying, yeah, I'll be perfect tomorrow?
Yeah, the procrastinators will put off perfection until tomorrow. I
think perfection, the quest for perfection, can lead to procrastination. I don't want to start until I've got the perfect conditions.
Oh, definitely. And I actually suffered from that a little bit. When I was younger, I had this idea of the soulmate. There's got to be this female soulmate for me. And so that frustrated me in the romantic field for several years, until I realized, it's up to me to develop a relationship and make it into a perfect relationship myself. So yeah, there's definitely that idea of, if you have this irrational or idealistic idea of perfection, then it's going to stop you in your tracks when you can't get there, because you can't see the way forward. You can't create steps towards that goal because it doesn't exist. It's a fantasy in your own mind. And so when you start to try to achieve it in reality, you find that to be impossible.
Yeah.
You're never going to get there. You're never going to achieve something that doesn't exist.
Exactly. I also just want to add, when Valliant was on our show, he lamented the Packer-Reisman schism, but he said he didn't have enough information to have an opinion on that, or the Watkins-Biddle schism that was going on at the time. But, for Packer-Reisman, I mean, he claimed that he wasn't privy to Leonard's research, so he didn't form a conclusion. But is that perfect justice? Is that seeking the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I mean, I don't want to nitpick Valliant, but he did claim to be morally perfect.
Well, I guess it depends on his level of interest. You can't blame someone for not being interested.
If you want to keep talking to both sides, you have to not do the research that would make you choose which side was wrong.
Yeah, I'm not saying I know what the case is here. It could be that he's evading so that he can maintain a certain status or relationship.
Yeah.
With what he sees as reality.
It just reminded me of that, truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as being perfection.
Yeah. He definitely wouldn't be following that little bit of advice.
So now to go more purely scholarly, Tara Smith did a presentation on perfection and pride, and says that perfection is not the same as success.
Certainly when you're pursuing rational values, it's better for people not only to try their hardest, but to succeed at what they're trying to do. But success is not what we're measuring when we discuss moral perfection. The virtue of pride, with its demand for perfection, urges people to practice morality consistently and ambitiously. And assessing perfection, we are exclusively judging whether or not the person does so. So it's important not to confuse the issue by introducing extraneous factors. Perfection is virtuous because it greatly enhances your chances of success in life, but success is not the litmus test of whether or not you are perfect.
So, Harry seemed to describe it in the case of the baby walking as success.
Right. So Harry was saying it's the completion or the achievement of a standard. And here, Tara Smith is saying that it's the practice. It's practicing of some sort of moral system.
That's actually
right?
consistent with your view about it's the process of the baby walk.
Yeah, and I tend to agree here with Tara Smith. I think she's the most insightful when it comes to this issue of moral perfection. And I hopefully we can like do a whole show on her take on this. But just with that one clip, it's she's making a very good point, very insightful point. And when you think of practicing morality, that's consistent with the life process. So you're living, you're constantly growing, improving, educating yourself, building things. So she talks about the building things, right? So I tend to agree with that view of moral perfection. And I think it's all, if it's not the definitive view, I think it's on the right track towards a definitive view.
Well, but in this next clip, she uses two different examples of using perfect to say it can always be better. I'm not sure if they're completely consistent.
Think of a pitcher in baseball who throws a perfect game, or a perfect host of a party. Now, in both cases, we can imagine still better performances than those that we praise as perfect. The pitcher might have thrown all strikes, right? He might have thrown not even a single ball. Imagine that. You can imagine that, right? The host might have rewarded guests with generous cash prizes as they left the party, right? Look at this. Now, the reason that we don't demand such things in order for a person to qualify as perfect, throwing a perfect game, being the perfect host, is our recognition there of the relevance of context. Since the object of the ball game doesn't require all strikes, as long as no opposing batter reaches base, which is the official meaning of a perfect game, the pitcher's team can't lose, there's no reason to expand our notion of a perfect pitching performance.
So, to me, she's conflating, something measurable, like, a pitcher's performance that means specific statistical things, and a perfect party host, which is more like an emotion. Like, it was the perfect party.
Yeah, there could be like a qualitative versus quantitative difference there. But I tend to agree, generally with what she's saying about the relevance of context. So, in contextual knowledge is important, and also the context of what's going on. What are you judging? Are if you're judging a pitching performance in a baseball game, then the rules and the circumstances around that game matter, are relevant. And then she does kind of switch context there to the party. So in a party, the goal is to have fun and entertain people and have social engagement. So that's different than a baseball game. But I think you can still understand the point of like the context of a party. So it wouldn't be a perfect party if people brought out knives and started stabbing each other. And it wouldn't be a perfect party if there were nothing to drink or nothing to eat, and people weren't talking. You might have a decent party if the food is okay, but it'd be a better party if the food was phenomenal, right?
Yeah, but I mean, maybe the music went out for 2 minutes, which it didn't have that big of an effect on the party. It was still overall a great party, but it wasn't perfect. Just like if one guy, makes a hit, it's no longer a perfect game.
Yes. So those are valid, I think. Those would knock it down a peg. You could say it almost was perfect. But there was this one flaw, there was one hit. There was one moment where the music went out and someone had to come in and fix the stereo or whatever.
Yeah, I just don't see why you would conflate perfect game, which is actually a specific definition, while you're trying to, convey this definition of what perfection is. In this next clip, she references an earlier Peikoff talk to your earlier point, using time as a measure of perfection.
Time. How much time did a person have to complete the activity in question, right? When you're trying to figure out, was this the best? Was this perfect? Was he under the pressure of a deadline? Was he responding to an emergency without opportunity for reflection or research or consultation? Were more pressing tasks occupying his time? The answers to these sorts of questions will directly affect what it's fair or rational to demand of the person.
Time obviously is a factor in judging somebody, and like how much time did they have to do something, that's a factor, but I'm not sure it's a factor in moral perfection. I think if you crack under the pressure of time, then you're not perfect. You didn't do it perfectly. If you waited until the last minute to do something and you're like about to miss your deadline, and so you're rushing yourself, well, there's an aspect of imperfection there. So, but the aspect of time that I'm more interested in is the period of time in which you're evaluating somebody. Like if you evaluate someone in their adulthood, or even within the last couple of years, you can say, oh yeah, they've been morally perfect in their adulthood, or within the last few years. You can narrow that period of time down, and you don't have to go back to their childhood and then point to childhood mistakes and say, well, this person now isn't morally perfect because they made all these mistakes in their childhood.
Well, that goes back to the Leibowitz example. I mean,
Right.
in this later phase of life, he can be born again, I guess.
Figuratively.
Yeah.
So you want to designate what time period you're talking about, and in the case of Tara here, where she's talking about deadlines and emergency situations, you want to make that context clear and say, within that emergency situation, they made some mistakes, but they're not necessarily moral mistakes because they didn't have the time to come up with the best rational decision.
I'm not even sure she's talking about moral perfection per se when she's talking about, hosting a party or something like that. She uses the formula later on that, time plus task plus doer. And maybe she got that from Peikoff, is what perfection is made of. Which, I think that as scratch drawing can be perfect if you're pressed for time, I guess.
Yeah, so there is that problem, I think. If you're going to use time, the time factor and the way she's using it, it can almost like always be used as an excuse for doing something wrong or imperfectly, and say,
Yeah.
oh, well, if they had just had more time, then they would have achieved more perfection. So within the certain period of time they had, they were morally perfect, even though they weren't. It's kind of a weird formula for coming up with moral perfection.
Yeah.
And if I thought about it more, maybe I'd refine my opinion. But I do think there's a problem there with Well, first of all, there's a problem with using emergency situations to judge someone morally. Because in emergency situations, you're almost acting on instinct or like a reflex. So you wouldn't really want to judge someone based on their whole moral system when they don't have, when it's a unique, strange, life-threatening situation where you got to act immediately, and you don't have time to sit down and think about every aspect and think about what should I ideally do in this situation. You're just going to have to act because it's an emergency. And so
Exactly.
I think that those sort
morality
of
is hardly applicable in such situations as they truly happen. But I want to go back to a Rand quote about art, where she said, if one saw in real life a beautiful woman wearing an exquisite evening gown with a cold sore on her lips, the blemish would mean nothing but a minor affliction, and one would ignore it. But a painting of such a woman would be a corrupt, obscenely vicious attack on man, on beauty, on all values, and one would experience a feeling of immense disgust and indignation at the artist. I mean, might she feel similarly if somebody turned in a rushed piece of artwork?
Yeah. See, that's the problem. But usually you don't think of artwork being done under time pressure.
Right.
I guess commercial art might be done that way, but a painter who takes pride in his painting is going to spend as much time as it takes to get it right. So,
but any kind of activity, I mean, do you care if your phone doesn't work because the maker was pressed for time? It either works or it doesn't.
Yeah. So but in the same case, where with the painter, someone making a phone, he's going to want to make the best phone possible so he can produce it and replicate it. And
absolutely. I just don't know how much of an excuse time is. It's like, keep working at it until it works. If it's not an emergency.
Well, to play devil's advocate, I think she's trying to take into consideration real situations like having deadlines and emergencies. Not always having enough time to achieve what you would like to have achieved. Like if you did something under time pressure and then later you look back on it and said, oh, I would have done this differently. I think that's
boss,
also,
I didn't have time. It's still perfect.
If your boss is giving you that deadline and you're not able to make the deadline, then that affects your job.
Yeah.
So sometimes this also relates to what you're talking about before about having this idea of idealism that prevents you from acting.
Right.
So it kind of is related, I think, here to if you have a time crunch and you're under the illusion that you need to make it perfect, then you're going to miss the deadline. So you kind of have to do something to a lesser degree of perfection. You have to say, this isn't my best. As long as you admit that, like you're honest with yourself, this isn't my best work, but I did what I could do under the, within the time that I had. And within the resources you had, because you could also wait for better resources, right? Like you can make a building out of metal and it'd stand longer, but you only had wood, so you work with wood.
It goes back to the metaphysics. Something is metaphysically better than nothing. So, but this does actually relate to the last clip we have from Tara. She's asked, should a person walk away from these lectures thinking more about perfection?
Do we need to consciously set out to be perfect? Should a person walk away from these lectures thinking about perfection more often? Should the word surface more regularly throughout your days? I don't know. I don't have a single clear answer on this. I think you do need to make a conscious commitment to perfection. That's why pride is a distinct virtue. A person needs to recognize the need to work on his character. And objectivism certainly urges us to be in focus. It doesn't preach, here, accept this moral code, and then follow it blindly. No questions asked, no further attention necessary. Right? Now, I'm not sure that means that you need to think of the word perfection dozens of times daily. I doubt it, but I'm not sure. And you might want to try it. I mean, you know, some of you might want to try it, and if it helps get you to be more moral, that's great. That's wonderful, right?
So she's not sure whether we should think more about perfection. I mean, maybe she could have thought it through a little more before giving a lecture on the subject. Maybe she just ran out of time. That's possible. I'm not sure if that counts as doing one's best.
Yeah, I think she could have had a better answer, but then I don't know like how much time she had to deal with the question. So it's
Judge Judy always
possible.
says to people when they don't have evidence, she's like, "Where did you think you were coming today?"
Yeah. Well, it's possible that you don't have an answer to a question. You don't feel confident enough to put it out there in public. Like maybe if you were talking to her in private, she'd give you more like a speculation. But it's sometimes it's good to withhold your speculations in public because you don't want other people using them and running with them. You don't want to create this false impression of your own ideas out there. You know, I thought about it a little bit, and I think thinking about perfection is important at an abstract level because you want to know what it means. But when you're actually living your life and going about your daily life, what you should be thinking about is what is good for me? Like what's in my best interest? What is rational? Things that you can actually focus on. Because like perfection is this can be this vague future goal that is hard to imagine. I mean, if you can
Right.
imagine it, if you can imagine it and you see it as you see a path forward towards it, then go for it. But
Instead of better, you can go for best.
yeah, but you best, sure, best within your ability to achieve. Like you should, what I would say is you should be able to have a sense that you can get to where you want to go. Like you can see the steps. Like if you have a goal of building a house, then you should be able to see the steps of you actually achieving that. But if
Yeah,
you want
but
to,
there is a place to sometimes just move forward without even having that full knowledge.
yeah, you want to have some sense of where you're going and what you're doing, and that should be that it's good. Like within your vision of the future, you should be doing what you think is good for your life and what
Yeah.
is rational. You use your thinking ability, your reason, your critical thinking to the best of your ability to achieve what you think is good. And that's the best I can come up with. And if you call that perfection, then so be it. Um, that's that's being morally perfect because I think having an unbreached rationality is a very good starting point for the essentials of moral
Sure, it's
perfection.
something to aspire to at the very least. For this last clip, Yaron was recently asked if he disagreed with Ayn Rand on anything, but he seems to think that that's out of his skill set to judge her on philosophy.
Is there anything you disagree with Ayn Rand on? Yeah, I mean, there's certain formulations, there's certain things in application that I might disagree with. I'm always hesitant about it because she was a genius and I am not. So I'm hesitant about disagreeing with her about these big things. And but nothing in philosophy. To a large extent, partially because I'm not a philosopher. I mean, everything she said in philosophy makes sense to me. And I think she was such a genius that if she says something wrong or something inconsistent, then it'll probably take a philosopher to figure that out. Probably not me.
Is that a perfect answer? I mean, did he do his best to consult with any other objectivist philosophers? Has he not had enough time with 25 years leading the Ayn Rand Institute?
Yeah. So I think everybody has to take the responsibility of evaluating what they hear, even if it comes from a genius. He seems to defer to her genius in an irrational way. Like he's saying, I'm not gonna give you my thinking on her mistakes because she's a genius. and I'm
He's
not.
done the same thing with Peikoff. I think it's a tactic he's learned to deflect such questions where you can't really say, oh, I disagree with Rand on nothing, but he says, yes, I disagree is like this faux independence. Then it's like, oh, but I'm not smart enough to, criticize her on philosophy. It would take someone else to do that. When it's really more, if he says that, he's going to be kind of a pariah of the group if he says that he disagrees with her on philosophy. I mean, that's a tenet of closed objectivism.
Yeah, and he's also confusing the issue here by saying initially that there are a few formulations and things that he disagrees with, but then he goes on to say he doesn't disagree with anything in her philosophy. So what is he talking about? Because a lot of the formulations are part of the philosophy.
It's similar to what Onkar did at the beginning, and he is a philosopher, supposedly. Who am I to judge Rand? Or he really was more like, I didn't even know her. It was closer to a stated quote. But earlier this morning on social media, I saw someone in a group suggest that Rand was neurodivergent. And he was saying it positively, like it played a role in her genius. And then a known objectivist defending Rand replied, I don't appreciate the focus on trying to find something biologically or psychologically wrong in accomplished people. That's like trying to find feet of clay. Let's not focus on virtues and success, but try to bring amazing people down into the mud with the rest of us. But, in that quest for perfection, they're kind of shading reality under the guise of not wanting to tear down accomplished people. Their favorite accomplished people anyway. I mean, they'll still bash Trump and Musk's faults if the left says to be against them.
Calling her neurodivergent seems like pure speculation to me. Obviously, she was very bright. If being a genius is neurodivergent, then so be it. I mean, that's not a negative. That's she's superior intellectually. So
Yeah.
I don't understand what that means. What does neurodivergent mean? Does it just mean you're different from the normal people?
I think it implies being on the spectrum from either Asperger's or, I've seen other people talk about, there's something chemical in the brain that leads to more creativity that Elon has too. I mean, the main thing is that they were saying they didn't want, someone finding wrong in accomplished people. And that goes to perfection, because once you're accomplished, are you just going to get given the benefit of the doubt of perfection? Is that rational?
Yeah, well, I don't understand how being different neurologically would affect your morality. Like, unless
I don't think he was even judging her. He was just saying that's part of what made her smart. But that's not the main. I'm more focused on what the response was.
I know. I always try to get to something else, but so you're saying that they're trying to put down anyone who's critical of Rand, and that's a problem.
Not even Rand, of accomplished people.
Accomplished people. So I think I'm not sure trying to criticize their biology is the correct path, but just criticizing ideas, like if you have a criticism of one of Rand's ideas, that's valid. And I think if you can present it in a rational and respectful way, that's important. And, it should be addressed. And that's one of the problems I have with people at ARI is they don't do enough addressing of these criticisms. They kind of ignore the more important ones, or the ones that are, presented in a friendly manner, saying, look, I respect Rand. She was a genius. She came up with this philosophy that I admire, but there's some mistakes here, and I want to point to them and try to figure this out. They don't really engage with people too much that way.
Right, and that's why people are afraid to say she had mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm talking about the organizational level, people at ARI. I understand that there's scholars associated with ARI who will get into the criticisms, but when you're dealing with the movement in general and the popular form, the popular aspect of it, they don't allow much room for the critics, you know, and I think that's not wise. I think in order to move forward as a movement, you need to be able to criticize Rand's ideas at least, and even some of her moral issues if you think she had moral issues.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, I think it was a good show. It ended up being a little longer than I thought, but we touched on a lot of good issues. We'll let the audience judge if it was perfect or not. Any final thoughts?
I just again want to reiterate that I think moral perfection is an important topic, and that's why we spent so much time dealing with it. I think that it's more common than people think, and that you shouldn't use fictional examples to try to describe moral perfection when someone asks you for, you know, examples. I think
that is good advice.
At minimum, objectivists could point to Ayn Rand and say, look, in this context, she was morally perfect. And that's why we love her, and we love her philosophy, and call ourselves objectivists.
I don't even agree with that, but that's why I'm more of a fan.
Yeah, you're a fan. And I'm being pushed into the fandom world, I think, by the others.
Give us another 3.5 years. All right, great. Well, this has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff, along with William Swig, and we will see you next time.